For real this time.
Okay, we're on.
So, welcome to the Van Cave, gents.
Good to be back. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's been a while. Well, not to anyone watching this, but to us, we got ahead on episodes and took a little break. Had a sailing trip and doctor checkups and all kinds of craziness going on, so we're back on track. But this episode, the next couple, I am going to finish up kind of a series with some aviation archaeology. And I apologize. I mowed the yard yesterday, and I should
You
not
have
done
had
that.
the worst time with allergies this year. I don't remember you ever having this bad a time.
Well, I still have some voice problems from the surgery, because I was intubated for so long. And I'm allergic to the pecan fuzz, and which I mowed through a ton of that and vaporized it. My wife and I can barely talk this morning.
Wow.
Let's see how this Dinkelacker Pilsner goes down with it.
Nice. Dinkelacker. The Acker is the field.
That's good. Didn't help my voice, but it's good.
But it's good, yeah.
I've been getting a lot of questions about like LaCroix and all those things. People ask me, how do those taste? And I think you told me one time it's like somebody ate whatever the flavor is and then burped into your mouth just so you get just a barely any hint of it.
I hope I said that because it's brilliant.
Yeah, and I tell that to people. I say, this is the best description that I've ever heard, and it's exactly what it's like.
I like that.
I could tell you what the coconut one tastes like.
Yeah. That brings back the 80s.
Yeah.
That's back to my lifeguard days.
Yeah, it brings back summer camp. Chicks wearing cocoa butter.
Yep. Yeah, that does it.
Oh, yeah.
So, despite the levity of the Van Cave, this is a pretty serious topic. As we talked about, I believe it's going to, at this point, be the last episode. I can't remember the number, but we talk about aviation archaeology in the quads. And as I do with my friends, I kind of drag you guys into the wormhole of some of the stuff. Growing up in Midland, how many times do we hear the story about the mid-air collision over Permian Estates?
Right. Yeah, I heard that several times as a child and then as a teenager, and then it sort of was forgotten. I think that popularly it was forgotten. The old timers remember it, like our grandparents' generation, like people who would be our grandparents or older, like if our parents
older
had
siblings.
Us a little,
Yeah.
So that's one of those stories that almost was sort of lost to antiquity, because as the generation who experienced it gets older and older and begins to pass away, no one's going to remember that firsthand.
And did you hear about it before us?
No, I didn't.
You live in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I didn't get to Midland until the late 90s.
Oh, that's right.
And so whenever I got here, it was just kind of, school and everything. And I'd never heard about it until you guys brought it up.
So this was October 24th, 1956. And the stories we heard as kids before this is Tim and I growing up in Midland, 70s and 80s, was that there was a mid-air collision over Midland, Permian Estates, and wreckage and bodies fell out of the sky.
Right.
And I have to, later on, how am I going to frame this? Becoming a professional investigator years later, you hear stuff like that and you wonder, okay, how much of this just got completely fantastic?
Right. Because
how much of it was embellished?
Because that's what happens.
Right.
Right.
So we heard about bodies falling from the sky, corpses landing in bathtubs and flower beds and
shrubberies.
The helmets hanging from the power line that they said still had the head in it, and all of this just mayhem and hardness. And so what happened is, as I got into researching plane crashes, there's really nothing around here that's a super mystery as to where something is, or reports of lost airplanes. But I got curious as I learned about how to get these records. I thought, hey, man, let's see. I want to see what really happened. Mm-hmm. And so I did two things. I got the crash report from the Air Force, through a Freedom of Information Act request.
Yeah, we should preface all this by saying that the mid-air collision happened between a military training fighter jet,
Right. Oh, yeah. We'll get well into the details.
and a civilian aircraft.
Yeah, this is a military aircraft involved, and it happened in a period of time during the Cold War where the secrecy really got crazy. And I have the actual report, and I'll hold it up for the camera and show you all the redaction. Yeah. And it's crazy.
Yeah, I've seen it. It really is crazy how much they redacted. Yeah.
So what I did just to kind of bone up on it and see what happened is got the military report and then local newspaper articles, and found a couple of pictures taken by people who were there, not part of the media or anything else. So, and a lot of folks still remember this. And the reason I have these two guys here, Tim and Mike, you guys are all familiar with, we kicked around the idea of making a film about this. You guys are filmmakers and had a really good eye for this. The problem was we didn't have any luck finding anybody that really wanted to get on the air and talk about it.
Right. Everybody's willing to answer questions about it who remembers it, and they're willing to make social media posts about it and that sort of thing. But when we said, we think it would be important to West Texas history that we make a short film about this and interview some people and compare it to historical photographs and the official government documents we have about it, just so that it can be part of Midland and West Texas history. Boy, nobody wanted to be interviewed. Nobody wanted to be on camera about it. Yeah. And the project kind of fell apart, which kind of broke my heart, because that really would have been something. I've been involved in making historical documentaries about West Texas before. I did a project with Judge Hyde before he passed away, and a few other things. And I really was fired up about it, but like you said, no one really wanted to play. So
yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was just gonna say, I remember kind of during those first couple of meetings that we had about all of it, and I know we even recorded on a phone in one of them. But we went into it, and after that first meeting, it's like, okay, this is cool, this is interesting. I want to get more into this. And as we kept going further, and everyone just kept saying, no, we don't want this, we don't want to do this, we don't want this. And it was just kind of like, just pushing. It just kept pushing us back, and then, just always kind of wondered.
One thing I found, especially about older Midlanders, they tend not to want to talk about or regurgitate bad things that happened in the past.
Yeah.
I ran into the same thing when I was researching a murder that happened in the late 70s over by Alamo Junior High. Yeah. And I got a bunch of social media messages from older Midlanders who I didn't know, saying the family doesn't want this talked about. It's 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's just sort of a strange thing that's, I think, part cultural about West Texas and West Texans and kind of the way they approach things, that West Texans tend to be pretty positive people. Native West Texans can find the positive in anything, and living out here, you pretty much have to.
Yeah.
So I think that part of that becomes ingrained in the culture, is that let's forget bad things that happened in the past, or let's not sensationalize them or try to, make them historic in any kind of a way. I don't know. Maybe I'm over projecting my feelings on that.
I don't think so. No. But also, Midland, Texas, there are people that have been here a long time, but our history happens fast and it disappears fast.
That's very true.
Right. If suddenly some alternative energy popped up and oil was no longer needed, this place would disappear. This would be a giant ghost town. Yeah. It would look like, Chernobyl or something.
It would be us and a few goat herders.
Right. So I didn't find, I want to be upfront. I'm not going to get into, there are no conspiracy theories on this. It's very straightforward what happened. And we found evidence for reports and things where we expected to, and places we didn't expect to find it. We didn't find it. It was a pretty straightforward, I'm not even going to call it an investigation. It was just a research project.
Yeah, it was a research project.
And the names of everyone they're published. We can talk about that a little bit, but
I think any of the names that were published in the newspaper or any of the public documents, I think we can mention those. But anything that was redacted, we don't want to necessarily.
And I don't have anything beyond that.
Okay.
And the reason I think this is important and I think I said this in the last podcast about military aircraft. This part of the country, West Texas, and all over the United States and all over the world, there were wars waging overseas, and World War II is an example. And the effort that was going on right here in West Texas, in the larger cities, towns at the time, like Midland and Odessa, and in the tiny little places where we've gone, the Marfas and the Alpines, there were tremendous efforts, a lot of things going on in the for the war. There was training and a lot of support, and this is a part of that.
Right.
And it's military history to me as someone who's in the military, and I'm also Tim and I are both pilots, and we're into aviation, and these things are important to remember, and it would be hard for this to happen today.
Here's what fascinates me about it, and as we begin to discuss the details of it, this is something that, just based on all the documents that you were able to find, all the research that we did, this is something that could not happen today because air traffic control is so much better. Like, they learned all these types of lessons as object lessons and improved the system to a degree that if the system is followed correctly, this accident between this T-33 and this Cessna 170 could not happen today the way it happened in the 50s.
This is something else that I see a lot in my military and police career, and firearms training and aviation and motorcycles, all the stuff we do, is when you see something weird and you go, why is this here? Why do we do it this way? I wonder why this happened. Mm-hmm. Somebody's probably paid for that change with their life.
Right.
So you have to get into that. M1 Garand, whatever, depends on whose YouTube channel you watch.
Right.
They put a seal over the sight adjustments on those things. Why would you do that? Well, because people were messing with their sights. They were missing targets and costing lives. So there are these little discs, over the screws. Little things like this, even something as narrow as that, becomes a piece of history that you can hold in your hands today, and that's kind of how I look at these sort of things.
Right.
So this one goes back October 24th, 1956, and the military aircraft was a Lockheed T-33. That's the
trainer version of the P-80 shooting star.
Trainer version of the Shooting Star. And it was a training mission. It left Webb Air Force Base, and it left at almost 2 o'clock. Left Big Spring, Webb Air Force Base. So just a few minutes down the road, especially a few minutes at that speed.
Oh, yeah.
That was a fast airplane. There's still some of them flying. Now, this was a training mission. We had Captain Roy Roberts, instructor pilot, and he was in the forward seat. So this is tandem. So one guy sits in front of the other guy. The student pilot, Lieutenant Lowell Hill, he's in the aft seat. And what they were doing was an instrument landings, instrument approaches. Now, what this means is they're training for conditions where you cannot see outside of the airplane. So this would be heavy clouds, fog, what have you.
Yeah. Instrument meteorological conditions.
Right. Mm-hmm. And to do this, they have a hood. Yeah. They call it the hood, flying under the hood, IFR hood. I don't remember from this one if he was actually under the hood or if he had the sticker that goes over the visor.
Right.
They have them, and I have an IFR hood, and I cannot find it. But
that would have been great to show.
Yeah, it would have.
For those of you who are not familiar with this sort of thing in aviation, think of horse blinders in a way.
Well, think of if you take a welding mask and pop it up, that's sort of what it looks like. And what it does, and imagine driving your car, and you can look out the windows, and all this does is it restricts your vision where you can only see the instrument panel.
Right.
And that's the whole idea. In an airplane, some airplanes, most now, you can navigate entirely by instrument. And that's what these guys were training for. And you have to do it under the hood, as they say, to check out, to prove that you can do it before they give you a rating to do it. And that's what they did. They flew in. I don't remember the runway numbers off the top
4-3.
of my head.
It was 4-3, I think. 4-3 doesn't exist anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, 043. Okay. If for those of you in the Midland, Odessa area, it is the runway that runs parallel to Business Loop 20 or Old Highway 80.
So it's the shortest of all the runways out there.
I believe so. It's there, but it's been closed.
Okay, so it's no
Xed
longer
out,
it's no longer an active.
The last
runway.
map I looked, yeah, and I drove by there today and forgot to look.
Okay.
So what they were doing is practicing these approaches. Now, in this situation, the student's in the back. He can't see out, and so the instructor pilot is also functioning as a safety pilot. His job is to sit there and look for other airplanes. If the student gets in trouble, to get him out of it, and if he's teaching him at the time, to provide guidance or whatever.
Yeah, obviously the pilot cannot engage in any VFR activity because he's wearing that hood.
Yeah, VFR is visual, so he can't look out to see if he's over the right spot or see the runway until it's a certain.
So that's the
time.
Instructor pilot. That's one of his responsibilities that he's bound to during this training exercise, is that he's got to take care of all that.
So the military aircraft shoots an approach. And they make a successful landing, and they go around to do it again. They'll do this several times. They call them touch and goes. Touch the wheels, where the instructor is satisfied that, okay, you've made a successful landing. All you would have to do is cut your power, drain some airspeed, eventually put on the brakes, and you would be fine. And then they take off again. The reason they do that is, if you stopped, you would have to go all the way back to the end of the runway. You have to get off and taxi. So you just touch. The instructor goes, "Yeah, we're good. Hit it," and take off. So not long before that, a Cessna 170A, and I'll put pictures of both these aircraft up as we talk about them, left Ector County Airport. Ector County Airport's now Schleiermeyer Field, and it was bound for Bowie, Texas. This is a 4-place or 5, I guess, maybe. I'm not clear on how they were set up then, but
it was probably a 4-place. Got to remember this was the 50s, and one of the children was an infant. Yeah. So
there was a family on board. It was a dad, mother, father with an infant, and the wife's parents were all on board. So 5 souls, and They left at it was a few minutes earlier. I think I got the numbers in the I know I have the numbers in the crash report. And they left Ector County Airport, Schleiermeyer Field. They were going to Bowie, Texas, and just from what I put together, the picture in my head was that they flew around Midland to the north. So they came toward Midland, flew around to the north, and I'm guessing they were probably going to fly Interstate 20, Bowie's up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
But they didn't want to go through the controlled airspace of the Midland airport, so they went north first, maybe.
Right.
And it didn't work in the 50s like it works now. Like you've got class Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta airspace, and then you've got a lot of stuff. You got Class G, you got Class Echo, and then Class Echo transitions. You've got a mess of airspaces. So my guess is that what they were doing is they left Odessa. They went way out north to make sure they missed the controlled airspace of Midland,
right?
What is now Midland International. And then, like you said, I like your theory that they were just trying to get to the interstate so that they could follow it for a ways until they turned off to go to Bowie.
Right. And it makes total sense to fly that way. And something that's important that I was thinking about while I was mowing the yard, in this day and age, even with GPS, wherever you fly, there are local landmarks that everyone knows. All the pilots that fly there know where they are. And when you're in uncontrolled, you call out where it is. Mm-hmm. I'm over this, I'm over that.
Yeah.
And the numbers are all kind of rough, But if you're over Ryan, you know how far you are from Midland Air Park and things of that nature. So he was doing his job. He'd probably done this before. It was a pleasure trip. He was the aircraft owner, had come to visit family in Midland, Odessa. I'm assuming Odessa, since he was in Odessa and he was flying back. So as he made this turn, He found himself over Permian Estates, close to where
Yep.
Mike lives now, which is the Business Loop 20, straight off that runway, 6.25 miles off that runway. And the T-33 had just departed, was powering out, and he hit the Cessna, smacked into it. And I'm going to put the pictures up here. What you're looking at is their photographs from the crash report, and you're looking at models that show where the how the aircraft's impacted, and you'll see that the rudder of the fighter pretty much just cut that Cessna in half.
Yeah, it basically sheared the left wing off the Cessna. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And
believe so.
if I can remember, it's been a while since I read the Air Force's report on this, but their opinion was that the instructor pilot probably saw that 170 at the very last minute and nosed down, which saved a complete direct hit, but there was still a collision, and I think that they were slightly above and behind the Cessna. The Air Force in their report, I think it says words to the effect of they felt like that at the last minute the instructor pilot saw the 170 had just enough time to nose down so it wasn't a direct hit, but still tore the Cessna.
I'll put
apart.
a picture up right now. It's Tim as the way Tim was holding his hands. Yeah, so he struck the port side, and it sawed the airplane in half. I mean, it did. You have to imagine what these aircraft are built for. This is the equivalent. I was thinking about this. I was riding my motorcycle a couple days ago. How would I explain this? This is like a Ford F-350 hitting, like a
Yugo.
Well,
no, maybe not a Yugo, but
like my Nissan. Rogue.
Yeah, it's like a big heavy vehicle hitting a light compact economy vehicle.
Right. And what happened, much to my amazement as I got into this, it happened just like every story we ever heard on the school bus. It rained bodies. It rained wreckage. Yeah. It was horrible.
That's one of the things that I was surprised to learn was actually true, that it actually bodies, because of the nature of how the 170 was compromised and the fact that the instructor pilot managed to punch out, although he didn't have enough altitude for his
well, there was also separation.
Oh yeah, there was separation.
There was something failed to separate.
Right.
I would have to pile through that report.
I would too. Either way, his ejection seat malfunctioned, and he didn't really have enough altitude by the time he ejected for it to work properly anyway. So you had the instructor pilot was basically airborne, free of the aircraft, and then everyone in the 170, because it was torn to pieces, they basically fell out of the airplane.
Right.
And I'm not trying to be morbid. We're not trying to be morbid or gruesome about this, but it's just that for years and years and years, I heard the stories about this, about how it literally rained bodies from the sky. And I thought, man, you know how urban legends work and how stories become more magnified and they become folklore over time.
Become exaggerated.
Well, as I read through those reports, I started realizing that, oh my God, that is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was horrible. It's absolutely horrible.
It did happen, and it's in the newspaper. It's in the military report. One of the victims of the 170. Now, so the student pilot went in with the military plane.
Yeah, he never got out.
And we don't know if he was injured, if there just wasn't time, if there was a failure. They don't know, but the instructor pilot ejected. The Cessna is ripped in half. One of the bodies fell through a roof into a bathtub. Mm-hmm. Now, my home was constructed around that time. They're built the same way, same as yours.
Yeah.
And to imagine the kinetic energy it would take for a body to get through the sheathing all the way into a bathtub, I'd have to look again to see what the altitude is. And there was the infant was actually found in a flower bed. Mm-hmm. The engine of the Cessna fell into a kitchen of a home
and started a No, it was the fighter jet that started
the
the
fighter
fire.
jet. Yeah, it actually burned the home that it hit. It burned it completely to the ground. The most remarkable part of all this is no one on the ground was even injured.
Right.
Because of the time that this happened, Jane Long, where I went to school as a kid, is nearby. And a lot of people saw this because they were being let out of school. But there's just a lot of, I have to go out and knock on doors to interview people, witnesses or serve subpoenas. And that's the worst time of day to catch somebody at home,
right.
2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So people are out, they're gone. And so every house that something hit, they were either gone or it just missed them simply. And the main house, the heaviest hit was empty at the time, and it was completely destroyed. I'm going to show a picture right now that was shot by Larry Mitchell, and actually has 2 pictures, and these are the best pictures that were taken. Well, that we have. Everything else is newspaper, so the resolution is not great. Larry Mitchell ran, what was the name of the camera
Midland
shop?
Camera.
Midland Camera.
Mm-hmm.
I was a photographer in high school for the annual and the yearbook, so we all knew him.
He's a fellow ham radio operator.
He's a ham. He was a ham. He moved, and he posted that picture on Facebook, and I messaged him, and he did indicate he had more pictures, evidently much more graphic, and I asked him about it. And we found out he got the letter, but he was gravely ill. He was an elderly man. He was gravely ill when he got it. And when he passed away, his daughter found it and answered me. And she said, you guys can use this photo. So I have not even published them. In fact, this is the first time they've been published since I got them through Facebook. Okay. I didn't put them in the blog post because I hadn't heard back. She's going to let me know if they find any of his other photos. But the wreckage was scattered out. Here's the thing. I want to say this right now. There was a very accurate plot of where the wreckage fell in the report. Mm-hmm. And we dug through, when was the last time you looked in a Polk's city directory? That was pretty cool. Oh, my
gosh, yeah.
But it was very accurate. We know everywhere all this stuff happened, we know where it is. If you live in that neighborhood and you would like to know if your house was a part of that, I'll be glad to tell you, but I don't want to publish addresses or anything else. It was over the Apache Street.
Right.
There went a blank.
Yeah, the Permian Estates basically is the area. Well, you said it best. In and around Jane Long,
3,500 block of Apache.
Yeah.
And what's remarkable about this, when you look in the old newspaper articles and all that, it will say TV Kreitz of exactly this address said that he saw it.
Some of the, of course, it was the 50s, so the main people who were at home at that time were housewives.
Yeah.
Remember, there used to be this thing called housewives who raised kids and, where am I going with this? We're not having a political discussion.
Oh, there went.
Whoa,
I've
easy.
Been there goes the algorithm. You kicked it off. I heard it.
Sorry about that.
No.
Anyway, but there were a lot of housewives at home, and that's one thing that I noticed was that in the newspaper reports it would say Mrs. John Jones or whatever, whatever her husband's name was, Mrs. Edward Johnson or whatever, said that she saw this, that, and the other thing. And so most of the eyewitness accounts were actually from housewives.
What was really interesting about that, I've had a lot of people message me and say, hey, I saw this, or anyway, I'll get into more of those stories. Most of them, they were women, housewives. But what does a housewife do, when the kids are in school? Well, that's when she goes to the store. Mm-hmm. That's when she goes and, in those days, the fabric stores, they would go because they made clothes and repaired clothes, and they took stuff to the cleaners or whatever. They ran errands during that time of day, and that's one of the reasons everything was the way it was.
Yeah.
So I did have a guy call me, or he messaged me. He grew up in the home where the engine fell into the kitchen, the engine of the Cessna.
Okay.
Did I tell you about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He grew up in that home, and there was obvious patchwork on the house, and they could see, he got up in the attic and he saw it.
He saw where they repaired
Yeah,
it.
and he goes, I
Wow.
grew up at, and he gave me the address, and I looked it up and compared the chart and everything. I'm like, yep, that's it.
Interesting. By the way, it's okay if you want to be a housewife or if you don't want to be a housewife. I was sitting back here while you were talking, thinking about how all that came out, and I thought people could really get the wrong idea.
I
Isn't
was
it
staying
nuts?
away from that.
Yeah, you can be whatever you want in life. That's the wonderful thing about it. It's just that I guess what I was trying to say is that most people, younger people especially, who might be watching this podcast, don't probably remember a time when there was that nuclear family aspect to how we organized families and communities. And so, yeah, literally the moms were at home most of the day. They were getting the kids off to school, bringing the kids home from school, getting the meals ready, making clothes. It was domestic. They were, it was, more of a domestic lifestyle back then.
Yeah, it was, and it was different. And it was a day when you could work a blue collar job
and make a good living
and make a good enough
with a
living.
single income.
Yeah, with a single income to do
right,
that.
yeah, the wages were good compared to the cost of living. You weren't taxed to death like we are now. It basically takes two incomes just to survive these days because of that.
It does. Oh man, yeah, we'll totally tangent off, but it was a different world.
Yes, it was,
and that was the social fabric, and that's how we did it. And
right, and that's all I was trying.
I have no problem with that. I have no problem if a woman wants to forgo her career to see to it that her kid grows up in a space that the child is loved and not warehoused and not institutionalized.
Right.
Because I was at home with a grandmother, and circumstances changed. I went to a daycare, and it scared the shit out of me. I hated every second of it. I was too young to be there, but it all changed. But that was it. And that's the cool part about looking through the newspaper on that. And
yeah, just the culture of the time.
yeah.
And another thing that I was really impressed by as we were doing all of this research, thinking we were going to make a documentary about it, was how the community pulled together and how everybody knew each other.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Neighbors. This is another thing I think that we've lost. That is a bad thing. We've lost sort of a community spirit with our neighbors. I know some of my neighbors, but I don't know all my neighbors. I'm not close with all my neighbors. Back then, I can remember my grandparents. Boy, they knew everybody up and down the street. They knew about their lives. They knew about their kids. If Freddie, who lived across the street, little Freddie, if he needed someplace to go after school, or he wanted to come over to my grandparents' house for an after-school snack or whatever, it was kind of one of those kind of deals where neighborhoods were very close-knit.
It's very clear in the news, especially in the newspaper articles and the stories of people who experienced it, that was exactly what was going on in Midland at the time. You and I tail-ended this growing up.
We did.
We caught the end of it. But back then it was a completely different animal.
Yeah.
You're about to say something.
Well, yeah, I was going to go back to the report, I don't remember offhand, and I can't remember if you said it earlier, but did this happen on a weekday or was this weekend?
It was a weekday.
Yeah, it was a school
kids
day.
Kids were in school. October. It was a school day. And the takeoffs all happened at like 2:45, 2:15, 2:45. I'll get to it eventually. It's going to come up. So fortunately, there was one fire, the main house that I explained, on Apache Street. And the house was a total loss. It burned away.
But no one was hurt.
No one was hurt. Yeah,
part,
just the people. I was trying to recall I wanted to say this was Midland's greatest air disaster, but there was actually one with more loss of life later in the 80s that crashed at Midland
at
International.
Warwick. No.
Warwick,
I remember that one too.
Yeah, and I meant to check that right before we got here. But this is our only mid-air that's on record that anybody knows about. So we'll move on with it. I checked with the police department and a few other places just to dig through all the information we could. The best I can tell, it was all handled between the military and then the CAA, Civilian Aeronautics Administration.
It later became the FAA.
It became the FAA, yeah. And they said the primary accident, they called it supervisory error on the part of the instructor pilot. And then he did not see the other aircraft in time to avoid collision. So for whatever reason, he didn't see it. And as we were talking, they're obviously in a pitched up attitude. We're assuming the Cessna is more or less straight and level. Mm-hmm. So, did he make that dive, or he did? They assumed he made that dive at the last moment. So that meant he could have been partially covered by the nose. But the next thing was, they said installation of the standby compass precludes unobstructed vision forward. So there's this big compass that sticks up on the dash, kind of like the tachometers on a drag car, that's right in the pilot's view, and they're thinking maybe he just didn't have a good view when he hit it. And another contributing factor was that regulations did not require light aircraft to be controlled under VFR conditions. So like you were saying earlier, what he did today would just freak everybody out by just taking off from one airport, flying by another one, and never saying anything. He
was following the rules essentially at the time.
Everybody was following all the rules.
Right.
That's one of those examples that of, like we said, why is there a screw cap on the side of this rifle? Because there was a disaster, because at one time we didn't have those. Yeah. Well, that's exactly what happened here.
And things like this, and I'm sure this was obviously not the only incident that led to changes, but now we have directional altitude ladders, basically. So depending on what direction you're going and what type of flight mode you're in, you're at a certain altitude, and it's divided by certain increments, so that oncoming aircraft are going to be at different altitudes, even in odd altitudes, if you will. That's oversimplifying it, but
it looks like the control zone. Okay, back then, I think this was on when I got my license in the 80s. There's 1 nautical mile up to, I forget what altitude, above the airport. So it's a cylinder of airspace around the airfield.
You're talking about modern?
No,
modern,
old days.
Old days.
When I first got my license. Okay. And so it was just this imaginary cylinder that was a nautical mile or whatever it was. Big giant cylinder of airspace. So now it's more like an upside down wedding cake.
Right.
In the way it.
Yeah, you've got a cylinder like in Class Charlie airspace, which is what Midland International is now. You got a cylinder that goes like this, and it goes up to a certain altitude, and then you have a wider cylinder that goes up like this, that goes to a certain altitude. And so it's hard. Now, the closest thing to that still exists is Class Delta airspace, which is still just a single cylinder of airspace. So, and at that time, actually, when you got your license in the 80s, that Midland International may have been Class Delta. It may not have been Class Charlie at that time, but I don't know. It's before my flying time.
I know if you flew out of Eagle's Nest, which was at FM 1787 and 1492, or Sky West, which was then Sky Ranch at the end
at the end of one Midkiff and 180.
They were not in that zone, and so and also in uncontrolled airspace or small uncontrolled fields without a tower, as pilots they'll broadcast in the blind.
They talk to each other.
Inbound.
You identify your aircraft, where you are, what your intentions are. And that's what everybody's doing. So if you're turning on on downwind for a certain runway, and someone else is coming in straight final for that same runway, you know what that aircraft's doing. That aircraft knows what you're doing, and you can actually talk to that pilot in an untowered at an untowered airfield and say, "Hey, what do you want? You want to do? Why don't you go ahead and go in? I'll go around." You know, you kind of talk amongst yourselves, and and most of the time, if it's light traffic, it's easy to figure out. You're just polite to one another and look out for one another, and you figure it out. You know, and there was a lot more of that, I would imagine, because number one, there was a lot more uncontrolled airspace in the 50s, but also there were a lot fewer pilots and fewer airplanes then too.
Well, we also had the conversation of what about the pilot of the Cessna? Was he not listening? Was he not aware? Well, he could have been, and also when you're flying and you're doing a lot of things, if you miss something on your checklist or you're just simply on the wrong frequency, and I've done that, and I've gotten in other people's way just because I didn't check, I didn't change over. You know, I took off and I'm supposed to go this frequency or that one. I mean, it's back in the 80s again, and I just didn't check. I made an entire flight one time with my radio off because I was carrying, just a big brick handheld with the Terra. We call them the blue brick. So these big, so you can't really hear it. There's no lights on them so I'm just flying along, just yammering into this box that's the whole time. Yeah. And I landed, and one of my buddies, he said, "Hey, I need that radio later, so be sure and turn it off. Don't run the battery out." Okay. Well, it's already off. It's been off for like 3 days. So it's just, no matter what sophistication, what level of technology you're on, you're never going to get out of the shit happens window.
Oh, yeah.
So it's entirely possible.
Especially in aviation.
Yeah, especially in aviation. Yeah. So it's entirely possible.
But it's interesting now that today, even if you're in uncontrolled airspace, you can, you can leave from Midland Air Park, and then you can transition into the Class E, and you can call Midland International and just make a VFR request for flight following.
Yep.
And you can tell them where you're going to go and what you're going to be doing, and they'll watch you. They'll keep an eye on you, even though you're VFR. And if anybody else is in your area, they'll call it out. Hey, they'll call your aircraft and say, "Hey, look out for traffic at about 10 o'clock, about 500 feet below you," or. I mean, it's just so much better now, obviously, than it was in the 50s just by reading these reports. The system and the protocols and all the rules, there are a lot of rules, and they can be hard to follow, and especially for new pilots, it's easy to make mistakes. But the system is just fantastic these days compared to what it used to be.
And still, I was flying at Bernie Stage 2 years ago, and what's the Queen Air, military Queen Air, got way closer to me than I would have liked, and nobody said a word. They didn't talk to me, I didn't talk to them. I saw them, they were close enough for me to hear, and that was it. They're way faster than me. I was in a motor glider, and also I was at Eagle's Nest in the 80s, and I've had B-1 bombers go under me. I remember I wasn't super low or anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, they would be map of the earth, and you could hear them rumbling, and they would go under you. So there's, what are you going to do about that? So interesting chunk of trivia, something I had never, ever heard of until this happened.
Right. Well, and this whole thing was a lot of fun for me. I love learning about West Texas history and Midland history in particular. And Mike, I know you. I mean, you're into the whole document. You're like me. You look at most everything of that type of interest. Like, how can I make some kind of a film?
How can I tell this story?
How can I? And for me, a lot of times it's having been a journalist and professional writer. How can I write a story about that? Whatever. There's always that. You're like me, man. You look for the creative angle on it every time you see something like that. So this was really interesting for me because I learned a lot about the history of the area where I grew up. I learned a lot about aviation history and circumstances related to what happened when rules were very different and protocols were very different. So I really, really liked this. I wish we could have made the film out of it. That's the one thing I regret in all this.
Another thing that happened on this was I had people talk to me. Again, I have taken and analyzed and studied people's statements on criminal cases for decades now. And I had people say things like, yeah, that happened right under my house. Or right over my house. I was standing under it when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I saw it happen.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a couple of people I talked to on social media who said...
But you get to talking to them, and you go, I say, well, oh, cool. Where did you live? Because I wanted to plot it. You know, I just kind of wanted to know what it looked like from there. Because I wanted to be able to say, this guy right under it saw.
And they were nowhere near it, yeah.
Well, they were nearby, but... How many times have you seen a traffic accident? Mm-hmm. Or how many times did you hear it and turn and look and see cars flying everywhere?
Right. I think a lot of that happened. That's what I was going to say. I had some people talk to me on social media about it when we were doing the research about this and talking about it. And I was like, that story doesn't jive with all of these reports that we've got under the Freedom of Information Act. And what happens is, like you said, a lot of times when people say they witnessed a car crash, they didn't actually see the car crash. They just saw stuff flying out of the corner of their eye, and they saw the last few seconds of the car crash. And I think that's what happened here. And also with 60 years of history and these people maybe getting a little older, you and I am guilty of this as a guy in his late 40s of remembering things in a way that I more wanted to remember them than they actually happened.
Right.
And then when I really sit down and think about certain things, I go, you know what? That's not the way that happened. The way I'll tell a story.
It's the false memory.
It's a false memory. Yeah. I'll tell a story about something and then I sit down and think about it that night, and it was something that happened a long time ago, and I start thinking about that story, me telling the story about what I recalled, and then I think, no, I don't think that's actually the way it happened.
Right.
The reality of what you actually saw starts coming back, and the embellishment of your imagination, and you wanting to kind of dramatize the story for your buddies to keep them engaged. Yep. All of that stuff, false memories play a big part in that.
The one thing we never figured out through all this is if there was ever actually still a head in that helmet. But knowing what I know about anatomy and forces and seeing a lot of accidents and explosions and things like that, I don't find that very plausible.
No, I don't either. The thing that I was told by one person who talked to me on social media, again, someone who didn't want to be interviewed, was that someone they knew, they were a young kid in school at the time, but someone they knew, a parent figure or a neighbor or someone, they were looking for the baby, or they were just searching the area, and the person found the baby and found it in basically, like you said, a flower bed or in a bunch of flowers,
shrubbery.
Anyway, it was a real pretty area apparently where the baby's body landed, and the sentiment that she conveyed to me was that he always felt like if the baby had to die, then God made the baby land in a beautiful place in this beautiful little flower bed.
I've heard that more than once.
Okay, yeah.
It depends on what source it came from, but yeah, the flower bed is.
Yeah, and that seems to corroborate most of the stuff. The child did come down in a garden area.
Definitely,
So interesting. It's interesting to disseminate all of the urban legend and all of the popular sentiment,
the evolution of the story,
and the evolution of the story. That's a good way to put it. Over what we were actually researched and found in the data.
The newspaper. This is where I was going with this. As I was going through the newspaper, and again, I think everybody. I'm going to try to keep this short. Everybody just needs to go to the library, whip out the microfiche on a newspaper in Midland, Texas, or wherever you're from. If you're watching this, and I've been hearing from people in Australia, New Zealand. Go look at your archives, pull out the newspaper for your hometown or wherever you live right now from 1956, and just read it. It was incredible.
Yeah.
But that day, or I'm sorry, maybe it was the next day, a mechanic at Webb Air Force Base stole a T-33, just like this one, the very next day and died in a crash next to the refinery on Big Spring.
That is horrible.
Man.
He, and I don't know, I'm explaining why I don't know a whole lot about this crash. And I'm 90% sure. Guys, I'm sorry. I've not had a lot of sleep because of the allergies. I think it happened the next day. Same kind of aircraft, same air base. And he made a comment like, I could fly just as well as any of these college boys or whatever. And he was a mechanic. And he had a taxi ticket, which what that was.
Yeah, crew chiefs could taxi aircraft and
yeah,
mechanics.
other people could. They didn't want to have to call a pilot out to get in an aircraft and drive it on the ground like a golf cart, 100 yards from the flight line to the hangar or whatever. And also, you needed guys to take them out of maintenance, tie them down, run the engines up, and run tests and make sure they're cool to fly. And that's the kind of ticket this guy had. And well, he took off, off in the air. And I think they launched a mission to find him and talk to him on the radio and tried to talk him in. And I don't remember all the story. He did die in a crash near the refinery. Okay. Now, I started looking into this, and as I researched it, I found an old, like long dead forum for an historical group for Webb Air Force Base. And I found a guy who was there and knew the person who did that, knew the man that died. His son was researching it. And so I got in touch with that guy. I haven't even told you this yet. I got in touch with the guy who was writing on it, and he's gotten the reports, and he was kind of like where we were. Do I just write a blog? Do I, what do I do? And so I didn't want to just snatch it out from under him. And I'm putting this on my podcast right now. But he and I had a discussion. He's had a lot of family changes, positive things, babies and jobs and all like that. He's a little older than I am. And he has it all in a box. And he said as soon as they get settled, after a couple of things are done, he's going to write it. He's going to put it all together. Awesome. But yeah, right after that, this happened.
That reminds me of the story of, I wish I could remember this Marine's rank, but his last name was Foote, Foote, and he stole an A4 Skyhawk from Marine Air Base El Toro in '86.
I think the history guy has that on.
Oh, does he?
I think he does, yeah.
Well, a buddy of mine who lives out in Orange County, California, did basically a motorcycle video at Marine Air Base El Toro, which was closed at the time, and he got caught by the cops. And
I remember that.
He luckily they let him go, but they were basically out drag racing on those old runways like idiots. And that piqued my interest in Marine Air Base El Toro, which now is mostly gone. They have destroyed most of it. This is 5 years ago. Now it's mostly destroyed. They're building houses out there. It's a huge, development area. But there was a line mechanic or some sort of a crew chief mechanic who I don't know, but he was a pilot. He was a glider pilot, actually. He was a sailplane pilot. And he had tried several times to enter into the pilot training program in the Marines. But he had some sort of a physical malady, and I can't remember if it was eyesight or what it was, but they told him no, basically. They said, no, you can't go into the pilot program. It's not going to happen. He got mad and went out at like 2 o'clock in the morning, out onto the flight line, got inside a grounded A4 that did not have very much fuel in it, that had some kind of a mechanical problem, hauled ass down a dark runway and went out and flew over Catalina Island and out over it for like an hour or something. The time may be wrong, but it seemed like in my memory of the story, it was about an hour. Finally, they talked him into coming back, so he came back. They lit the runway up, got everything set up for him, and he had to go around like 3 times, but he landed that son of a bitch.
Yeah.
And here is the deal. From what I was able to find out, he was discharged without criminal penalty. Like, they didn't press charges against him, but they did discharge him. But he didn't go to jail. He wasn't court-martialed, anything like that. It was a weird, weird deal.
Wow. That came up. I don't remember what somebody mentioned that in this forum of people who were stationed at Webb Air Force Base when this happened, when this guy did. But unfortunately, he didn't. Like I said, he almost hit the refinery. I think he was within 100 yards of the refinery. And I was looking at it, and you and I had this conversation. I think a couple of us did. We couldn't figure out what was the refinery in 1956. We looked at aerials, and there's a big gap in the aerials of the time. So we couldn't figure out how close we came. But there was another fatality in relation to that. A deputy or police officer was running lights and sirens to that and hit a woman in a car, I think it was, and killed her. So there've been, just this. A lot of people died in West Texas around these accidents at the time.
And it's
in those 2 days.
Yeah, but you got to keep in mind, too, that in the 50s in general, a lot of people died in car crashes.
Oh, yeah.
The death rate per capita in car crashes in the 50s was...
Oh, yeah.
Any snowflakey attitude toward this nanny state and the safety state, these days pales in comparison sentiment-wise to how many people actually did die per capita.
Yeah. Any of us who slid across that 6-foot vinyl seat in a wide turn,
or who were laying in the rear dashboard behind the rear seat of our parents' car.
That was
when the brakes were slammed on.
That was our airbag. Mom would reach out.
Yeah. My dad used to have a Ford Ranger, and they have the seats up in the front, and then just a little space right behind it. It wasn't, no actual seats back there. And anytime we would get into that car, it would be me and my brother would have to climb back in there and just find a spot we could sit down and hold on to something while my parents were in the front. And any turn, you're holding on to the sides, you're holding on to the seat forward. So it's
Yeah, we had like a 1968 Ford LTD, which is like a frigate. I mean, they're just enormous. And I was when my mother was in an accident. Somebody ran a red light and hit her, T-boned her, and I was standing up in the floorboard, leaning over the front seat when it happened.
Oh.
Just pow! I'm lucky to be here. Maybe that's what's wrong with me. I think that covers it, guys. There's really, honestly, despite the tragedy involved, there's just not a lot to the story otherwise.
It's just something that I think, like you said, from a military standpoint, from a West Texas standpoint, I think it's something that makes for a good podcast because it's out there now.
Right.
It's history.
It is. And one thing I want to add, it's a long story why it's not there, but I will be adding, I'm going to publish or post a link to my written blog with all this stuff on it that has more photographs. Also, I will, through a technical problem, I did not have the newspaper articles on the written blog. I'm going to add those.
Okay.
Like the full page. There was just a problem in the formatting of that we couldn't get it to work. So I'm going to put all that on there so everybody can see it. All this is available at the public library. And again, folks, if you have questions about specific homes or any details like that, give me a call. I don't think anybody would want to know that their house at 1234 Main Street had a dead person in the bathtub as a result of this, So that's the only reason.
Yeah, I agree with that.
This is all public information. If you dig enough, you can find it. I'm just not going to be the guy to tell you unless you ask me privately. So
right on.
I think we're good. Gentlemen.
Cheers, boys.
Thank you.
Good times. See you guys next time.
Good one.